Hello, and welcome to Beyond Biotech, the weekly podcast from Labiotech. I'm Dylan Kassane, and this is episode 151 for the podcast. We're only a couple of days away from the biggest biopharma partnering conference of the year, the Bio International Convention. As part of Labiotech's coverage of this year's event in Boston, we'll have a special episode of Beyond Biotech next week with interviews and insights live from the floor at Bio. It's sure to be a great episode, and you'll find it in your regular podcast feed on Friday. This week, though, we're bringing you a conversation with entrepreneur and biotech blogger Alex Telford. Alex is the co-founder of Convoke Bio, a company that helps biotechs and pharmaceutical companies organize information to make better drug development and commercialization decisions faster. He's also the author of one of the most intriguing and thought-provoking articles of the last year, titled simply, "Some Questions About Biotech That I Find Interesting." I hope you enjoy my conversation with Alex as we dive into some of those questions, including a couple that might just be unanswerable. So Alex, welcome to Beyond Biotech.
Good to be here.
Alex, I want to start by letting you share a little bit about your journey into biotech. What really sparked this interest in biology and medicine and in technology?
Yeah, I tried to think back on what sparked the interest, and I couldn't really think of a specific inciting incident. I think I'm just a generally curious person. I like knowing how things work. I had a great biology teacher in high school that probably shifted me a bit towards biology than I might otherwise have done. If I had a great physics teacher, maybe I'd be doing physics. But I think biology is an infinitely deep and complex space. And if you just like learning, there's lots of opportunities there to learn about bizarre organisms and rare diseases and things like that. So I think that's what kept me interested over these years.
Over these years, look, you studied at UCL. You've worked in life science consulting as well with Charles River. Did that sort of shape your experience in the field? Did you draw anything from working in those places and studying there that sort of made you the biotech entrepreneur that you are today?
Absolutely, yeah. So when I studied at university, I chose to do biochemistry, and that was really because I liked chemistry and I liked biology, and I didn't want to make a choice between the two. But I had no real sense of how I could apply the degree to an industry role. I had intended to do a PhD, but actually I didn't enjoy lab work as much as I thought I would have done. So after doing my undergraduate master's, I was looking for what I could do with my degree and interests that wasn't more science in the lab, more academia. And pharma was an obvious application of life science skills and knowledge. I didn't really have any idea of what it took to develop medicine. I didn't really have any specific interest in the operational aspects of developing a drug or just what it's like to work in the pharma industry until I started working there. So really, I applied to Charles River, which is a life science consulting, or they do broader work, but the division I applied to was a life sciences arm because I just wanted to do life science projects. But yeah, I had no real sense of what the work would be like or if I would enjoy it. I just knew that I like life sciences, and I worked there for 7 years and got to work directly with a lot of different pharma and biotech companies. And really, I think the experience of working in the domain and getting to tackle real world problems, applied problems, see what it takes to turn an idea into a medicine was what deepened my interest in the industry and applied life sciences. So yeah, it wasn't like I went in with the intention to do pharma, but really the passion grew from working in the domain for a long time and then seeing just how complex it is to make a drug.
Was there any passion for the business side of the pharma industry as well?
Not initially, but it definitely developed, and it developed relatively quickly. I think it is one of the most interesting industries. Well, obviously, I can't think of one that I personally find more interesting. It's the most interesting industry to me, but I think it is an extremely deep industry where making a drug is so inordinately complicated. It's actually amazing that any drugs get made at all. You have to think about it's this incredible multi-parameter optimization problem to bring a drug to market. It takes up to 10 years, 15 years, you have to think about, can you manufacture the drug? Can how do we design a clinical trial to show the efficacy? What patient populations do we select? How is the competitive landscape moving along? How do we reimburse this drug? Who's going to pay for it? So all these questions are just individually incredibly complex and deep, and you need to pull them all together to actually, make a decision about whether or not to develop a drug. So I think the complexity of the industry and its almost like fractal depth is what got me interested. And I think from a business perspective, the dynamics of the industry are also very interesting. It's venture capital like, where a very small number of drugs will generate the vast majority of industry returns. So that really influences how people make decisions and invest in new opportunities. It's really like winner takes all almost in some therapy areas. So just that like portfolio strategy and management aspect was something that started to interest me as I spent more time in that space.
Today, of course, you're at Convoke. What sort of led you to move from consulting into actually starting and founding or co-founding your own business then?
Well, really just the experience working with the companies directly and seeing just the complexity of the knowledge work that's required to make decisions about drug development. So, if you're informing a clinical trial design, or you're deciding whether or not to in-license an asset or acquire a company, or go from phase 1 to phase 2 or phase 2 to phase 3, just the decisions require you to pull together so many different sources of information, and it just felt inordinately complicated to collect all these different pieces of information from literature, from industry databases, internal discussions, then like synthesize it across all the teams and make sure you have buy-in across the organization. And just the knowledge work burden is really, it was immense. And it felt like, at least in the consulting perspective, and seeing some of the process of the companies, we were doing all this work, and then a lot of it got thrown away. So it was very one-off. And it felt like there could be an opportunity to do this in a more efficient way. So for a long time, I was interested in how can we productize parts of this knowledge work, or like how can we like define software, like make software definable processes that would be repeatable, that could save people time and make drug development more efficient ultimately. But there was never really a strong path to doing that. And I got pretty excited around GPT-3 and when some of these language models came out, because really for the first time software was able to take on fuzzy tasks that were previously just the domain of human experts. And that's when I got excited about like GPT-3, ChatGPT, GPT-4 was when I really got excited about the potential for language models to actually like make software that really works for a broad set of use cases in the industry. And I think before, the regulatory process enforced a lot of consistency in processes across companies. Everyone thinks about things in a roughly similar way and evaluates opportunities in a roughly similar way, but they all have their own nuances in what therapy area they're going after, or what internal templates, how their go no-go decision process looks, which countries they're launching in. But it meant that you couldn't really build a software to account for all the edge cases. But now with language models, there is that potential, I think. So that got me excited.
You've mentioned a couple of things that are all in a row: the GPT-3, GPT-4, AI, drug development, commercialization, software as well. Maybe we should just take a step back. For people who haven't heard too much about Convoke, can you explain what you do and what sort of problem you're actually setting out to solve when it comes to drug development and commercialization?
Yeah, so we're building effectively autonomous knowledge workers for the biopharma industry. So the theory we have, and the thesis behind the company, is that the way knowledge work is done will fundamentally shift. Then people are going to need new workspaces to manage and delegate work to AI. So there's a whole strata of knowledge work that involves just collecting information, putting it together, synthesizing it into templates, then feed up to decision makers or regulators. And think of all the work that goes into investigators brochure, for instance. That touches medical teams, that touches CROs, ClinOps, scientific teams need input in there. And so all the burden to go and pull that work together it's necessary, but it's millions or billions of hours of knowledge work. And we think there's now an opportunity to unlock an immense amount of latent capacity in the industry by freeing up that labor intensive, burdensome knowledge work that frankly no one really enjoys, reading, pulling out information from papers and summarizing derivative documents and filling in regulatory templates. So yeah, we're solving really information friction broadly. So how people find and integrate information, internal and external to their organization, how they use it to create deliverables. So I gave the example of an IB, but we're also excited about use case in competitive intelligence, so helping companies pull together up-to-date, automatically updated competitive landscapes, and some of the medical affairs applications. So creating scientific platform derivative documents from scientific platforms and things like that. But really, the ambition is pretty broad.
So sounds like you're streamlining, but this is also going to accelerate the drug development as well. It's going to save some time.
We hope so. Yeah, I mean, there's a massive amount of time is wasted in white space between trials, right? When a trial is running, there's you can only really speed it up with recruitment because you're bottlenecked by the underlying biology of the disease. And if you've designed your trial appropriately, then maybe you can show effect sooner. But there's not so much there, I think, for AI to do. But in between the trials, when you're planning, when you're digesting the results of the trial and planning your next trial and deciding whether or not to go forward, that can be a substantial fraction of the total development time, 30, 40% in some cases. And if you can speed that up and you can go quickly from one trial to the next, then you can accelerate development. So you can pull it down from maybe 12 years to 8 years. And every single day of delay is I think the latest numbers are $500,000 in extra spend. So if you can pull one day forward, then it's $500,000. And if you can pull 4 years forward, I'm not going to do the math, but that's substantial savings. So I think like acceleration, we're excited about time saving of the individual. People doing the work, we're excited about like what could they do if they're not spending their time copy pasting things from documents. And then we're, I think, also just excited about AI as a tool for knowledge discovery. So there's lots of stuff locked up inside companies, inside the literature that is interesting and could be used to generate a new therapeutic hypothesis, or could be used to improve an argument you make to a regulator, or when you're talking to like an informal discussion with a physician that your MSL might have. And I think if you can give everyone in your company the knowledge of your most knowledgeable domain expert in a particular domain, then you can really empower every individual worker to come to the best ideas, the best answers, find new hypotheses for drugs, for clinical trial designs, for so it's like really like enabling a self-learning pharmaceutical company is what we want to achieve.
Well, at $500,000 a day, your value prop is obvious.
Well, I mean, as long as we can do it, right? I think like the value. Everyone agrees that. This is why there's so much excitement about AI in the industry, right? Because it's obvious that the potential is there to streamline this laborious knowledge work, and obviously the technology is still new; it's still very early, so we're going to see the impact play out over many years. But working in AI now, it's very palpable. How fast it's moving and how much impact it's going to have on some of these use cases.
Alex, I wanted to have you on because I came across a blog post of yours from April in 2024. We're linking to that in the show notes here. It was titled "Some Questions About Biotech That I Find Interesting," and it was on your personal site there. Can you tell me what inspired you to write that piece and actually put these questions out there?
Yeah, so unfortunately, I don't write as much as I would like to these days because Convoke keeps me pretty busy. But when I was writing regularly, so when I left my last role at Charles River, I took some time to do idea exploration, and I took a lot of time out to do writing. So the way my writing process works is I just like to read a lot about what's happening in areas that interest me, which is often biotech industry. And I'll just keep a note of topics that I think could be good future blog posts. So really it's, read a lot, be exposed to interesting ideas in your field, talk to interesting people. That surfaces interesting topics. And then I keep a list down. And then over time, I would add to that list. And if I felt like I had enough of a narrative or a thesis for one of those topics that I'd accumulated, then I would say, like, okay, now I'm going to sit down. I'm actually going to write the blog post out. And then writing the blog post is helpful to actually, for me to think about an area and like deepen my understanding. And if other people enjoy it, that's a nice secondary benefit as well. But the way that questions post came about was I had accumulated this long list of topics and they'd been sitting there for a while. And I felt like I wasn't making much progress on them. At least I wasn't developing like a thesis or an understanding, or there wasn't enough data that I could go ahead and write an essay. So I said, well, maybe actually what I should just do is put these questions out on a post, and maybe they're interesting to other people as well. I don't know, but some other people have put out questions posts, like Patrick Collison has one. I think Alexei Guzzi has one. So some of these like online personalities have these like interesting questions posts. So I thought maybe I'll do the same thing. I'll just put out these questions, add a couple of bullet points of my thoughts or commentary about them, and who knows, maybe someone will like who's thought about this topic will reach out to me and send me some interesting papers that I hadn't known about, and then I could go ahead and write an essay. So that was the motivating thrust behind that particular post.
And does the act of actually writing it down, it has some sort of way of making things clearer or forcing you to think about things in a more structured way?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is why I'm not so concerned about AI replacing blog writers or whatever. People say like, oh, well, you can just ask ChatGPT to write you a blog post, and then that means that blog writing is obsolete. But actually, no. For me, the function of writing a blog is for me to do, like, by constructing my own argument, I get a deeper understanding of the topic. And when you write something down, it has to be logically coherent. It has to make sense to you. And the process of creating an essay then is like the function. That's how I explore a certain topic and how I develop an opinion on it. So I don't think AI is ever going to replace that function. So yeah, for me, it's just a very important way of getting to an understanding. And I do that at work as well a lot. So if I want to think about a new feature we're building, or what should we do in our strategy, then the way that I will explore that is by writing out a post, because everything becomes, all your fuzzy logic and bad reasoning becomes much clearer when you try to articulate it in a way that people understand. And then like I said, I never started blogging to get popular on the internet. I started blogging because I had a list of questions that were interesting to me in the industry, and I wanted to, the writing is the medium through which I understand those questions.
I mean, these questions, though, they span, a very broad swathe of what we see in the industry. It's everything from drug discovery, bioengineering, some revenue elements there as well, some regulatory elements, and even just some fundamental questions like, are pathogens the reasons that we age? Just really fundamental ideas about disease. Are these all just things you've come across when you've taken that curiosity and you're just reading, or are they things that you really want to take a deeper dive into with your company now?
I mean, some are more close to what we're doing at Convoke. So, I may take a deeper dive into those, or my opinions may develop. Others are just generally interesting. Like, I'm not doing anything on longevity. But really it's just, the genesis of that list was just a long notes document I have with, dozens, maybe even 100 different questions. They're the most interesting ones. But it's really like someone might mention something to me in conversation, and I think, oh, that's interesting. I put it down in the notes doc, or I might read a paper or come across something on Twitter and then put it in the notes doc. And I have no intention of really pursuing it further, but I think that it's interesting. So yeah, that's really, I mean, that's it. I don't necessarily, just because on the list doesn't mean that I have any intention to pursue it further. And some I don't expect to do anything on, but maybe there's value in putting it out there and saying like, hey, this is interesting. Because I think like one of the things I've learned is that um, if you work more in a domain, it doesn't take you that long to get up to the frontier of where the interesting questions are. And actually, like a bottleneck for progress, I think, is figuring out what questions are even worth asking in a domain. So if someone who's, maybe coming from a different background reads one of those questions and it inspires them to dig a bit deeper, then that's a great outcome.
I do want to dive into a couple of the questions there on your list, or at least the bigger themes that you have there. And one to start with is AI and its role in drug discovery there. You've talked about the capacity for AI to just help speed up drug development, to accelerate it there, to streamline a little bit. But what does that mean for the industry, do you think, more broadly? If drugs get to market a little bit faster, there's more money to be made, but there's got to be some implications beyond the business.
Yeah, I mean, we all hope that eventually it impacts patients and human health and improves health outcomes, right? So that's what everyone in the industry is working for. I mean, I think AI is such a broad topic, right? Like at Convoke, we focus on the applications of language models, but there's still a lot to be done in more traditional machine learning and AI. Just generally, like artificial intelligence systems are mechanisms to make predictions from data, and a lot of what there's a lot of ways that making predictions can improve outcomes in the industry. So what's the holy grail, I suppose, is can you improve the ability to predict probability of success for a clinical trial? Well, that's a very difficult question because probability of success is a coarse measure that's downstream of so many factors, like your trial design, the biology of the disease, what molecule you have, modality. So I think we're a long way from that, but still there's many subdomains that feed into probability of success that will be impactful. So like one is, like I could just talk about a few companies that I've come across that I think are interesting. One company is making their own models to better predict liver toxicity. So using machine learning to train a model on images of cells as you wash over drugs over those cells. So I mean that has potential because hepatotoxicity is one of the biggest reasons for drug failure in for molecules, and especially late stage hepatotoxicity is really damaging because it's hard to, if you don't see a signal in phase 1 or phase 2, then it can just show up in phase 3 in a larger sample of patients and completely torpedo a drug development program. So that's a more traditional application of ML, where we're building a predictive model based on imaging data. It's not a language model. And that has a massive potential impact if we can eliminate hepatotoxicity as a reason for late stage clinical failures. And then you have new surrogate endpoints. So if you can predict based on patient biomarkers or based on radiology imaging, can you develop new endpoints that help you predict when a cancer drug is working earlier in development, say phase 2, before you have to run the expensive confirmatory OS study. So I think there's a lot of applications like that where you're just trying to train a model to help de-risk the next stage of development. So you can either you make more informed decisions about what drugs you take forward into later stages of development, or you can even potentially remove some of those regulatory burdens, like having to run 2 confirmatory phase 3 trials. Those requirements are in there for a very good reason, and the reason is ultimately that we don't understand biology well enough. So I think AI has a great potential to help us understand biology much more deeply than we did before, or at least like develop models that can understand biology for us, and then we can apply those models. So yeah, I think this is like what Demis Hassabis has said at DeepMind. That's their goal, is to use AI as a tool to better understand biology. So that's like one set of applications I'm pretty excited about. And I think just generally there's industry trends that mean that um, it's a good time for language models and more of these tools that are focused on increasing efficiency of the industry to come along. Like, there's pressure, there's industries under significant cost pressure. So biotech doesn't necessarily do well in a high interest rate environment. So the cost of capital for biotech is pretty high at the moment, and that means that it's challenging to justify investments compared to when we were in a zero interest rate environment. So now biotechs need to run much leaner, and AI or language models. The promise is that, as the Anthropic founder said, every person can have access to a country of geniuses in the data center. So if you can scale out your team with compute, with access to these new language model tools, rather than having to hire a bunch of people, then that's like one way that you could build very capital efficient small biotechs. So we could have tiny teams taking drugs all the way to market rather than having to rely on an acquisition by a big pharma. So that's one area that excites me.
I guess one of the other things, though, is the other side of AI. Then, as we automate more things, we rely on machine learning. I go back to one of your other questions, which is where drug hunting falls on this luck skill continuum. Is there a danger we're going to miss out on something serendipitous by relying on AI?
I think it depends how you design the systems. Like, I think that I think first of all, we don't know what the future of work is going to look like, because language models are getting so cheap and so capable that you can just do things that you could never do before. So it's now not infeasible. I mean, we've done the math on this to get a language model to read every single paper that's been published on PubMed. So you can't ask a human team to do that. That's completely unreasonable. So I think if we apply the language models in the right way, we can just churn through so much more information than we ever could manually. And I think if you can do that, then it's an industrial revolution for knowledge work, right? You can do things that you had no capacity to before. You can read every paper, you can read every single thing that's ever been published on a given target in seconds. You can integrate information. Every single piece of information your company has gathered, integrate that in a single place and ask questions about it. So I don't think we know what it looks like when everyone has access to that just like level of intelligence. So the constraints become pretty different than they are today. You're constrained by really good data. You're constrained by questions. Which questions should you ask? You're constrained by good ideas.
I guess one of the other areas that you touched on in some of your questions there had to do with regulation and regulatory challenges. You've discussed, and I'll quote you here, the dance between timely progress and restrictive regulation in biotech. Why is this tension just such a critical question for the industry?
Well, the amount of work you need to do that's imposed by the regulators is really defines how much work it takes and cost and time it takes to get a drug to market. So if you could just, if we're back in the days of patent medicines and you could just set up a storefront and sell whatever you wanted, then the cost to develop a drug would be pretty negligible and just be the raw materials. But for good reason, we've imposed a bunch of regulatory processes to ensure that drugs are manufactured to a high quality so that we don't have, poisonings and contaminations that we used to have. We also impose a level of efficacy and safety data generation so we can properly evaluate the risk benefit of a drug. And these are necessary constraints to put on the industry because our understanding of the underlying biology is poor enough that we can't make predictions from first principles about whether or not a drug is going to work. Like we cannot engineer drugs in the way we can engineer a bridge or a software program, right? We cannot define the specifications and then pre-engineer that. Drugs are more discovered than they are designed at the moment. So yeah, I mean that's why it's critical, right? Because if you have more regulation, it costs more to develop drugs. If you have less regulation, it costs less to develop drugs. And getting the balance right is extremely difficult because the correct answer is not zero regulation. Then you'll just have a bunch of unscrupulous actors getting things to market and profiteering and taking advantage of patients who don't have any good options. And it can't be too much because then no one's going to develop any drugs, right? Like gene therapy is a great example where we had a period of time where there was a lot of exuberance for gene therapy and a lot of programs, a lot of funding, a lot of stocks that got boosted to really high valuations off the back of the scientific excitement. And now we're in a period of retrenchment where it looks like some of the science, there's difficulty from some of the scientific perspective, so delivery remains an issue. And also commercially, we've had some of the hemophilia gene therapies not do as well as was hoped. So, I think that gene therapy, if we are to realize the benefits of that treatment modality, we probably do need a new regulatory regime. Because if you look at most of the monogenic diseases, the population of patients is too small given the willingness to pay to make it cost effective to develop drugs under the current regulatory regime. So yeah, I think we need regulatory flexibility so we're appropriately matching the opportunity, the need, and the difficulty of developing a drug. So we're not just we're not preventing drugs from getting developed for certain diseases.
I guess it changes who does the innovation as well. The lower the regulatory barriers, it's a little bit easier, like you say, to develop something and to develop a safe drug. Whereas if those regulatory barriers are very high, you're going to need an awful lot of capital just to keep up, just to get going. Is it a little bit better for innovation if we just relax those regulatory barriers a little bit, or maybe just for rare disease?
Well, you're always making a trade-off between innovation and safety. And obviously the best for innovation is zero regulatory burdens. If you had no constraints on what gets developed and everyone could just make any drug they could come up with, and I could do it in my basement if I wanted to, I could order some plasmid and then just, grow up some bacteria and then make some recombinant protein, just inject it into someone without any constraints, then yeah, you're going to have a lot of innovation, but it's not going to be safe, right? So I don't think that's the right balance. So that's the tension really, is how much, as a society, what trade-off do we want to accept between innovation and safety? And over time, it seems to be the case that societies become more risk averse. Life gets more comfortable, you have more to lose in some ways. So regulatory requirements have, in general, tended to ratchet up over time. That's not always true. There have been some relaxations, so like the accelerated approval pathway. But human nature is really, or like societal expectations is the bound, and maybe even like the legal system. No one wants to get sued for making a drug that has a side effect, and the FDA or the other regulators is a system that allows, that we've agreed on as a society, is a reasonable burden to place on industry in exchange for, if the FDA approves something, then you can't necessarily you can in many cases, but it does sort of take some liability away from the drug developers, and that can make it worthwhile to have a regulatory system in place.
Indeed, that was one of your questions in there, I think, is the FDA actually good for industry? And it sounds like there's certainly a role for it to play in your view.
No, I think the FDA is good for industry. I think the correct amount of regulation is not zero. I think you do want a independent, opinionated regulator who can hold people in the industry to account. I think it's important that the industry makes products that people inject into their bodies to hopefully cure or prevent or treat disease, and that the public needs to trust what the industry makes, and the regulators a well-equipped regulator is a effective way to um, help maintain public trust, assuming the regulator, is um, operating effectively. So yeah, I think that's an important function of the FDA, is this helping create public trust, helping hold bad actors in the industry to account. You don't want someone selling a patent medicine out of a truck to damage the reputation of the entire industry. And I do think there is, things wouldn't necessarily happen, like randomized control trials wouldn't necessarily happen without the regulatory imposition. And it's very hard to know if something works without a randomized control trial, because we don't have these models that can predict when a drug is going to work or not, and we don't have the translational translational models aren't, in many cases, are not very good at predicting how a drug's going to work in humans. We do still need randomized control trials to actually figure out if a drug benefits patients or not. And the regulator is a useful way to impose scientific standards on the evidence that gets created and make sure that people aren't spinning those results in a way that is misleading. So yeah, I'm pro regulators, but I think that, as I've said in another post, I think the burden needs to be matched to the unmet need, and needs to be matched to there needs to be some consideration of innovation, right? Like gene therapy is a tough space. If we impose extremely high burdens on gene therapies, the industry may never develop fully, up to its promise. So I think there just needs to be, the regulator needs to be flexible, needs to partner with industry, and not just completely try to shut it down.
In your post there, you had some 27 different questions there, and covering all different parts of the industry. Is there one on that list that you think might just be unanswerable, that we might never get the full explanation to?
Yeah, I think the one that is maybe the most interesting to me is, and potentially unanswerable, is what is the false negative rate of preclinical testing? Right, a lot of people talk about the false positive rate, right? Like a drug that works in mice, and then you take it into humans, and it doesn't work. And there's a lot of jokes about, this drug works. We've cured mice, but we can't cure humans. But I think the other way around is also very interesting. I think that if you have drugs that work in mice and don't work in humans, it implies to me that there are drugs that work in humans and don't work in mice. So how many drugs are we missing because of that, right? Dogs respond very differently in some cases to certain drugs than humans do. Mice respond very differently. Non-human primates also respond quite differently in some cases. So do we have some fantastic drugs sitting on the shelves? Do we have cures that have a great mechanistic rationale for why they would work, and then we put them into a mouse and the mouse had some side effects? And if only we could have figured out that if we take this drug into humans, then we would have been able to cure the disease. But now we'll never know because it got stopped at the first hurdle. But yeah, it's practically unanswerable today, because we're not just going to give all these drugs to humans without testing them properly. I think we only get to answer it if we do develop more of these models that can, learn from human data to predict how they might respond, or maybe some of the models like for specific prediction tasks like hepatotoxicity that I talked about earlier.
This could even move us into something like a digital twin that we could run these sorts of tests on, rather than using humans. We could take the advantage of whatever we learn from the mouse, knowing it doesn't work, but throw it into a digital twin of a human, and maybe we can find something that we would have otherwise missed.
Yeah, I mean that's the dream, right? The FDA has said they want to move away from animal testing, and I think we should aim to move away from animal testing, because we should not be, in an ideal world, we would not be killing millions of mice and dogs and non-human primates. We could just test everything in silico. We're not at the point yet where we can quite do that. And actually I think the regulators' willingness to accept some of this data without animal experiments is higher than perhaps the sponsors, where if you don't do a mouse study and you don't do an NHP study, it's pretty hard to justify the capital expense for a phase 1 or a phase 2 trial. So I think there's a few different ways we can try and eliminate animal testing. One is through these better predictive models, like better predictive models, models to predict specific safety outcomes, toxicity models, maybe digital twins. I think we're way away from that, but would like to see. Obviously, that's something that we'd like to get to eventually, but also just making clinical development cheaper. So if we can get into humans quicker, if we can, but still in a way that's safe, then decision makers at pharma companies may be willing to forego certain animal experiments, then test in humans. I mean, one of the reasons why, we asked about, you talked about like, why is AI such an imperative right now for the industry? One other reason is that China is becoming very good at developing, at least discovering drugs, where they've moved at the value chain from being raw API manufacturers to discovering their own drugs. And it's not just fast followers, it's genuinely innovative stuff. And I think that, China they're a lot cheaper than Western scientists, frankly, and they can get into humans much more quickly than we can under the Western regulatory regime through the investigator-initiated trials. So that's a challenge for the competitiveness of Western biotechs, where you have an ecosystem that you can get into, you can test in humans very quickly, and your labor force is maybe 20% or 30% of the cost of a Western labor force. So I think we do need to find ways to make the industry more efficient, and AI is one piece of that answer. I think rational regulatory relaxation is another part of the answer. Another is just culture and different ways of working. And I think figuring out how can we be scrappier and how can we use some of these new tools to be hyper efficient and take advantage of some of the infrastructure that's put in place with new CROs and some of these new AI tools and regulatory pathways where available.
Alex, these were questions that you put out in 2024. Since then, has there been another question or maybe a couple of questions that have come to mind that you think, look, that's something else that I'm really curious about?
Well, I mean, there are always questions. One thing that I'm interested in now, and there'll be a piece coming out soonish, I think, is on the history of monoclonal antibodies. So monoclonals are a very interesting drug class because it took, from the first monoclonal, which was a mouse monoclonal that was approved, called orthoclone, it took another 10 years or so for the second one to be approved, which was rituximab. So I think monoclonal is a very interesting case study where you've seen a technology develop, and it took 20 years to go from the first approval to monoclonals representing a large fraction of approvals. And now about half, I think, of the top 10 drugs are by revenue are monoclonal antibodies. The top selling drug Keytruda, is a monoclonal antibody. So this drug class has now become potentially more important. I mean, I don't know if this is quite true yet, but it's definitely like challenging small molecules as one of the most important drug modalities. And we're seeing the costs of antibody manufacturing continue to decline. And it may be the case that with further improvements in manufacturing, we could actually think about making monoclonal antibodies such scale that we can treat infectious diseases in the developing world. So $1 to $3 per gram or something in manufacturing costs is where we might want to get down to treat some of these conditions. So I think it's an interesting case study of how a technology develops from early stage, difficult to manufacture, no set process, a lot of problems with immunogenicity. And then you slowly over time, we've optimized antibody humanization, we've optimized antibody manufacturing. I used to be manufactured in mice. Now it's manufactured often in CHO cells. Now we're getting AI to design antibodies for us instead of having to go through this expensive screening process and clonal selection. So yes, I think it's just a great case study to be aware of. This technology has gone from nothing to now a potentially of global importance, similar to small molecules. And what's going to be the next technology that will kind of reach that level of importance. And maybe it's gene therapy, but we're probably, if history is a guide, it's probably 15 or 20 years until it reaches that same kind of level of mass adoption and potential that monoclonals have reached.
Alex, for people listening who want to dive a little bit deeper into biotech, follow your journey, read what you're writing, and learn more about Convoke as well, where can they find you?
So I am a Telfo on Twitter. That's ATELFO. Convoke.bio is our website. And yeah, I think those are the main places to check. We're hiring software engineers. So if you're a software engineer, reach out.
And of course, we're linking to your blog there in the show notes. Alex, it's been a pleasure to talk to you today. And we wish you all the best of luck with Convoke.
Thanks. Nice to meet you too, Dylan.
That's it for this episode. Don't forget to check out all the latest news and analysis at Labiotech.eu. I hope wherever you are in the world, you have a great week ahead. Thanks for listening, and I hope you'll join us again next time for another Beyond Biotech.